the most insane person you've ever met? My college professor, Dr. Hendricks, seemed brilliant at first. She taught abnormal psychology and had this incredible ability to see through people's facades. Students lined up during office hours just to hear her insights about human behavior. I was one of them. Dr. Hendricks made me feel special. She said I had unusual psychological insight and invited me to join her private research group. Only 5 students were selected each semester. It felt like winning the lottery. The research meetings were held at her house, a sprawling Victorian off-campus. She said the informal setting encouraged authentic psychological exploration. We'd sit in her living room discussing case studies while she served homemade tea and took detailed notes. At first, it seemed like advanced coursework. We analyzed criminal psychology, studied personality disorders, debated the ethics of human experimentation. Dr. Hendricks pushed us to think beyond conventional boundaries. True understanding requires abandoning societal taboos, she'd say. We must be willing to explore the darkest corners of human nature. Gradually, the discussions became more personal. She'd ask us to share traumatic experiences, describe our fears in detail, admit to thoughts we'd never told anyone. For psychology majors, this felt natural. We were supposed to examine ourselves clinically. But Dr. Hendricks was doing something else entirely. She was collecting our vulnerabilities. Then came the assignments. I want each of you to conduct a behavioral experiment, she announced during our 4th meeting. Choose someone close to you and manipulate their behavior using psychological principles. Document everything. My assignment was to manipulate my roommate into changing her major. Dr. Hendricks provided specific techniques: how to undermine her confidence, plant doubts about her motivations, make her question her abilities. I tried to refuse, but she pulled me aside after class. I've been watching you closely, she said. You have natural talent for psychological manipulation. She showed me a file with my name on it. Inside were detailed psychological assessments, personality profiles, and photos of me taken without my knowledge, eating lunch, walking to class, even sleeping in my dorm room. Complete the assignment, or I'll share some interesting observations about your psychological state with the dean, she said. That night, I researched Dr. Hendricks online. 3 years ago, a graduate student in her program had committed suicide. 2 others had transferred schools suddenly after nervous breakdowns. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. Every significant advancement in psychology has required pushing ethical boundaries, she said. I'm training the next generation of researchers to be stronger. She showed me files, detailed studies of psychological destruction spanning decades, how to drive someone to suicide without leaving evidence, how to destroy a person's support system completely. And if I refuse to participate? Dr. Hendricks smiled coldly. Then you become a subject instead of a researcher. Dr. Hendricks pulled out another file, this one much thicker than mine. Inside were case studies of former students who'd refused to cooperate. Each file documented their systematic psychological destruction in excruciating detail. Meet Jennifer Walsh, she said, showing me photos of a young woman. Brilliant psychology major, full scholarship, bright future. She objected to my methods during her 2nd semester in the research group. The photos showed Jennifer's deterioration over time, confident and smiling in early pictures, then gradually more haggard, paranoid, isolated. The final photo showed her in a hospital bed, catatonic. I assigned 3 different students to work on her simultaneously, Dr. Hendricks explained with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a lab experiment. One befriended her and slowly poisoned all her other relationships with carefully planted stories about betrayal and gossip. Another spread rumors about her mental stability to professors and administrators. The third convinced her she was being stalked by creating false evidence, mysterious notes, staged encounters, fabricated threats. That's psychological torture. That's applied psychology, Dr. Hendricks corrected. By the end of the semester, Jennifer was so paranoid she couldn't function in social situations. She stopped attending classes, refused to leave her dorm room, and eventually had to withdraw from school. She was hospitalized for 6 months with what doctors called a complete psychological break. She flipped to the next file with the casual efficiency of someone giving a PowerPoint presentation. Marcus Chen, computer science major who audited my class. Very skeptical of psychological manipulation until he experienced it firsthand. Marcus's file contained fabricated evidence of academic dishonesty, forged emails suggesting he was threatening other students, and documentation of a systematic campaign to isolate him from friends and family. But what made my stomach turn were the detailed notes about his emotional responses to each escalating pressure. Marcus lasted 8 weeks before attempting suicide, Dr. Hendricks said matter-of-factly. Fortunately for our research, he survived, but the brain damage from the overdose left him unable to remember much of his time here. Retrograde amnesia is fascinating from a neurological perspective. She spoke about his brain damage like it was an interesting side effect rather than a human tragedy. File after file showed the same pattern. Students who questioned her methods became subjects in elaborate psychological experiments designed to break them completely. Each case was documented with scientific precision, control groups, variables, measurable outcomes. The only difference between Dr. Hendricks' work and legitimate psychological research was consent. How many people have you destroyed? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Destroyed is such a negative word, Dr. Hendricks said, adjusting her glasses. I prefer to think of them as contributing to groundbreaking research. Their suffering has advanced our understanding of human psychological limits in ways that traditional ethical research never could. She led me to her study, where the walls were lined with filing cabinets. Each drawer was labeled with academic years going back 2 decades. Every student who's passed through my classes, she explained. Detailed psychological profiles, vulnerability assessments, family backgrounds, trauma histories. Most of them never realize how much information they've given me during seemingly casual conversations. She pulled out a random file. Take Ashley Morrison, freshman year 2019. Single mother, financial stress, history of anxiety. She mentioned during office hours that she was struggling with chemistry. I had a graduate student tutor befriend her, then systematically undermine her confidence until she switched to an easier major. She never knew it was an experiment. The scope of what she was describing began to sink in. This wasn't just academic research gone wrong. This was a decades-long program of systematic psychological abuse targeting vulnerable students. Why? I asked. What's the point of all this? Dr. Hendricks smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her. Knowledge is power, she said, and power over human psychology is the ultimate form of control. Governments, corporations, military organizations, they all need to understand how to influence and manipulate human behavior. I'm providing them with the tools. She opened a locked cabinet and pulled out a thick manuscript bound in black leather. The title read, Applied Psychological Warfare, A Practitioner's Guide to Human Behavioral Control. This will revolutionize the field, she said proudly, running her fingers over the cover like it was a holy text. Traditional psychology focuses on healing and understanding. I've developed the science of psychological destruction. Governments will pay millions for this knowledge. Corporate executives will use it to control employees. Military strategists will apply it to break enemy morale without firing a shot. The manual was horrifying in its thoroughness. I could see chapter titles as she flipped through. Exploiting childhood trauma for maximum impact, creating paranoid delusions through environmental manipulation, the psychology of suicide induction, memory modification through sustained psychological pressure, and converting victims into willing accomplices. Each chapter contained detailed case studies drawn from her decades of experimentation on students. Real people's psychological destruction, documented and analyzed like laboratory data. You're creating a torture manual. I'm creating the future, she corrected. Do you think the human conflicts of tomorrow will be fought with bullets and bombs? No, they'll be fought in the mind. Whoever controls human psychology controls everything. She showed me a section titled Institutional Infiltration and Academic Cover. It detailed how she'd built her program, starting with small experiments on individual students and gradually expanding into a comprehensive system for psychological manipulation. The beauty of working in academia, she explained, is that everyone expects professors to study human behavior. I can conduct the most extensive psychological experiments imaginable, and as long as I publish papers about resilience and trauma recovery, no one questions my methods. She'd been hiding in plain sight for 20 years, using her academic credentials as cover for what amounted to a torture research program. But Dr. Hendricks wasn't just theorizing about future applications. She was actively selling these techniques, and had been for years. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Because you're going to help me complete the final phase, she said. Your assignment isn't really about manipulating your roommate. It's about documenting your own psychological transformation as you cross ethical boundaries for the first time. She pulled out a much thicker folder with my name on it. Inside were transcripts of every conversation we'd ever had, psychological assessments dating back to before I'd even heard of her class, and detailed plans for my own psychological manipulation. Everything you've told me about your childhood trauma, your insecurities, your relationships, it's all been recorded and analyzed. I have over 40 hours of audio material that could be used to destroy your reputation, your relationships, your entire future if necessary. The folder contained information I'd never shared with anyone. Details about my family's financial problems, my father's drinking problem, my mother's history of depression, even my own struggles with self-harm in high school. Information that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance and investigation. How did you get this information? I have students in every department, she said. Previous research group members who understand the value of long-term observation. They've been gathering data on potential subjects for years. Your roommate freshman year was one of mine. She reported every conversation you had, every phone call home, every moment of vulnerability. Your resident advisor was providing weekly reports on your social interactions and emotional state. Even your academic advisor has been sharing information about your career goals and personal struggles. The scope of her operation was staggering. She'd been identifying and studying students across the entire university, building a database of psychological vulnerabilities that she could exploit when needed. You've been watching me for 3 years? Watching, studying, documenting, she confirmed. You showed exceptional resistance to traditional manipulation techniques, which made you an interesting subject. Most students crack under basic social pressure, isolation from peer groups, academic stress, romantic disappointment. But you maintained your sense of self even when everything around you was falling apart. She showed me video footage taken without my knowledge, recordings of me studying alone in the library, talking to friends in the dining hall, even private moments in my dorm room. The invasion of privacy was complete and systematic. Your resilience made you perfect for the advanced program, she continued. I need to understand how to break people who can't be broken through conventional means. Strong-willed individuals who might resist standard psychological warfare techniques. She flipped to a section of her manual titled, Breaking the Unbreakable, Advanced Techniques for Resistant Subjects. My photo was on the first page. But everyone has a breaking point, she continued. The key is finding the right psychological lever. For you, it's your sense of moral obligation combined with your fear of abandonment. You can't bear the thought of innocent people suffering when you could prevent it, and you're terrified of being alone. She was right. And hearing her clinical analysis of my deepest fears made me feel completely exposed and vulnerable. Complete the assignment and become a valuable research assistant, or I'll be forced to implement a much more intensive study, she said. I have documentation suggesting you're psychologically unstable, potentially suicidal, and dangerous to other students. One call to campus mental health services, and you'll be involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. She showed me the fabricated evidence. Doctored emails suggesting I'd threatened self-harm, fake journal entries describing violent fantasies toward other students, altered recordings of therapy sessions I'd never attended. The documentation was convincing enough to fool any mental health professional who didn't know it was fabricated. But there was more. She'd prepared false evidence suggesting I'd been stalking other students, stealing from them, even conducting my own unauthorized psychological experiments. The file contained forged photographs, manufactured witnesses' statements, and fabricated digital evidence. The involuntary commitment would last at least 72 hours, she explained. During that time, I'd have access to you for intensive psychological evaluation. And once you're in the mental health system with a history of instability, anything you say about my research program would be dismissed as paranoid delusions. You have 48 hours to decide, she said. Complete the assignment and join my research team permanently, or become the subject of the most comprehensive psychological breakdown study I've ever conducted. I left her house feeling completely trapped. She'd outmaneuvered me at every turn, anticipated every possible response, planned for every contingency. Even if I went to the university administration, she had recordings and documentation that would make me look unstable and dangerous. Who would believe a psychologically compromised student over a respected professor with 20 years of tenure and dozens of published papers? But as I walked back to campus, I realized something important. Dr. Hendricks had made one critical error in her psychological assessment of me. She'd assumed that my moral compass would make me predictable, that I'd choose the lesser evil, manipulate my roommate rather than risk my own destruction. She'd calculated that my empathy would be a weakness she could exploit, that my fear of abandonment would make me submit to her authority rather than risk isolation. But she'd misunderstood something fundamental about my personality. My moral obligation wasn't just to avoid causing harm, it was to actively prevent it when possible. And my fear of abandonment was outweighed by my hatred of injustice. Dr. Hendricks was causing massive harm to innocent people, and I was possibly the only person in a position to stop her. That night, I began planning my own psychological warfare campaign. I started by researching Dr. Hendricks' personal history more thoroughly than she'd apparently researched mine. What I found was illuminating. She'd been married twice, both marriages ending in bitter divorces where her ex-husbands described her as manipulative, controlling, and psychologically abusive. She had 2 children who'd cut all contact with her years ago. Her own mother was in a nursing home suffering from what appeared to be artificially induced dementia, and Dr. Hendricks was listed as her healthcare proxy. She'd been using her own family as test subjects for decades. I found court records from her second divorce where her ex-husband had accused her of systematic psychological torture and deliberate attempts to drive him to suicide. The judge had dismissed these claims as hyperbolic, but reading the depositions, I recognized the techniques she'd later codified in her manual. Armed with this information, I broke into her house using techniques she'd ironically taught us about social engineering. I convinced her elderly neighbor that I was Dr. Hendricks' research assistant, who'd locked myself out while carrying important files for a grant deadline. Her computer password was pathetically easy for someone who understood human psychology so well, her birth year combined with psychology. She'd fallen into the same predictable patterns she'd trained us to exploit in others. What I found on her computer was worse than I'd imagined. Files on over 400 students going back 15 years, but also detailed psychological profiles of university administrators, local police officers, mental health professionals, and even FBI agents. She'd been studying and cataloging the psychological vulnerabilities of anyone who might pose a threat to her operation, but the most damning evidence was her correspondence with buyers. Dr. Hendricks wasn't just developing these techniques for academic purposes, she'd been selling them to private military contractors, authoritarian governments, cult leaders, abusive spouses, corporate executives, and even serial killers. Her research was being used to torture political prisoners, break whistleblowers, destroy activists, control cult members, and perfect techniques for psychological murder. Email chains showed her negotiating prices for specific psychological manipulation techniques. $50,000 for a method to induce paranoid schizophrenia in healthy subjects within 6 weeks. $100,000 for a protocol to make someone commit suicide while leaving no evidence of coercion. $200,000 for a comprehensive program to psychologically destroy an entire family unit. $500,000 for a course training intelligence operatives in advanced psychological torture technique. She was running a boutique torture consultancy disguised as academic research. I found invoices showing she'd earned over $8 million in the past 5 years, selling psychological warfare techniques to organizations that use them to destroy lives. Each payment was carefully laundered through academic conferences, research grants, and consulting fees. But the most horrifying discovery was in her personal files. Video recordings of her own psychological experiments, conducted in soundproofed rooms in her basement. Hours of footage showing students being systematically broken down through isolation, sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, and carefully administered drugs. I recognized some of the faces. Students who'd supposedly transferred schools or taken medical leave. They were all there, in her basement, being used as test subjects for her psychological torture techniques. But there were older videos too, recordings going back over a decade, showing her techniques becoming more refined and sophisticated over time. The early videos were crude, simple isolation and verbal abuse. The recent ones showed elaborate psychological scenarios designed to shatter a person's sense of reality completely. In the most recent videos, she'd progressed to what she called personality reconstruction, completely erasing a subject's original identity and replacing it with a new one of her design. The victims in these videos didn't even remember their original names or lives. I copied everything onto multiple drives, but I didn't just want to expose her. I wanted to destroy her using her own methods. I'd learned enough about psychological manipulation to understand her vulnerabilities perfectly. Dr. Hendricks was a narcissist who craved recognition but feared exposure. She was paranoid about professional rivals but trusted her own intellectual superiority completely. She believed she was untouchable because she understood human psychology better than anyone else. Those beliefs made her predictable. Using her own psychological manipulation techniques, I created a campaign designed to trigger her deepest paranoid tendencies, while simultaneously destroying her support network. First, I created fake evidence suggesting that one of her biggest buyers, a defense contractor paying her $2 million annually, was planning to expose her research to steal credit for her discoveries. I forged emails from the contractor's CEO expressing concern about Dr. Hendricks' instability and discussing plans to eliminate the security risk she represented. Second, I fabricated communications from a competing researcher claiming to have infiltrated her program and gathered evidence of her illegal activities. The fake emails suggested this rival was preparing to publish her techniques under his own name, while simultaneously reporting her to law enforcement. Third, I created falsified documents showing that the university was already investigating her for ethical violation. Fake memos from the dean expressing concern about disturbing reports and discussing plans to conduct a formal inquiry into her research methods. But the masterstroke was manipulating her relationship with her graduate assistant, David Morrison, a young man she'd been grooming as her successor, and, I suspected, as more than just a professional protege. I'd noticed the way she looked at him, the way she touched his shoulder during meetings, the special attention she gave to his psychological development. David was brilliant but emotionally vulnerable, exactly the type of person Dr. Hendricks was drawn to. Using information from her files, I created a carefully crafted psychological profile suggesting that David was becoming suspicious of her methods and planning to expose her to authorities. I planted evidence in places she was sure to find it. Fake journal entries in David's handwriting expressing moral doubts about their research, forged text messages between David and fictional FBI contacts, manufactured audio recordings of David discussing his concerns with imaginary whistleblower organization. Within 48 hours, Dr. Hendricks was spiraling into paranoid delusions, convinced that enemies were closing in from all sides. Her behavior became increasingly erratic as she struggled to manage multiple perceived threats simultaneously. She started destroying evidence frantically, which only made her look more guilty when investigators eventually arrived. She became suspicious of everyone around her, including David, which led to increasingly volatile confrontations that drove away her few remaining allies. But the psychological pressure was having an even more dramatic effect than I'd anticipated. Dr. Hendricks began exhibiting signs of the same psychological breakdown she'd induced in so many of her victims. She became paranoid, isolated, unable to trust anyone. She started seeing threats everywhere, interpreting innocent interactions as evidence of conspiracy against her. The irony was perfect. The master manipulator was being destroyed by her own techniques. She tried to flee the country, but airport security was waiting, tipped off by anonymous reports about a psychology professor carrying classified documents related to human experimentation and torture techniques. When the FBI searched her house, they found something that shocked even seasoned investigators who'd seen the worst of human depravity: hidden rooms in her basement that had been converted into sophisticated psychological torture chambers, soundproofed spaces where she'd conducted intensive studies on kidnapped subjects, video equipment for recording psychological breakdowns in high definition, medical equipment for inducing stress responses, and monitoring physiological changes during torture, drug storage areas containing experimental psychological medications and mind-altering substances. And 7 students who'd supposedly transferred schools or taken medical leave were actually being held captive, subjected to months or years of psychological experimentation. They were alive, but their minds had been systematically shattered and rebuilt according to Dr. Hendricks' specifications. One believed she was a completely different person. Dr. Hendricks had convinced her that her original identity was a delusion and that she was actually a mental patient who'd escaped from an asylum. Her recovery involved accepting her new identity as a research assistant, grateful for Dr. Hendricks' healing methods. Another couldn't remember anything from before her captivity and spoke only in psychological terminology, as if her entire personality had been replaced with clinical language. She referred to herself in the third person and described her emotions using diagnostic criteria from psychology textbooks. The third alternated between periods of catatonia and violent outbursts. Unable to distinguish reality from the elaborate psychological scenarios Dr. Hendricks had constructed around her, she believed she was simultaneously a test subject, a researcher, and a completely different person from a fabricated backstory. The fourth had been convinced that the outside world had ended in a nuclear apocalypse, and that Dr. Hendricks' basement was a survival shelter where she was being protected. She was grateful for her captivity and terrified of the possibility of rescue. The fifth believed she was voluntarily participating in crucial psychological research that would save humanity from mental illness. She'd been so thoroughly indoctrinated that she defended Dr. Hendricks even after being rescued and couldn't be convinced that she'd been victimized. The sixth had been subjected to personality-splitting experiments designed to create multiple distinct identities within the same person. She switched between different personalities every few hours, each with different memories, beliefs, and loyalties to Dr. Hendricks. The seventh was the most disturbing case of all. She'd been completely reconstructed according to Dr. Hendricks' vision of the perfect research assistant. Her original personality had been methodically erased and replaced with one designed specifically to serve Dr. Hendricks' needs. She had no memory of her life before captivity, and genuinely believed she'd been created by Dr. Hendricks as a form of artificial intelligence in human form. The investigation revealed that Dr. Hendricks had been operating her psychological torture program for 15 years, but the scope was even broader than I'd realized. She'd been working with a network of accomplices at universities across the country, and internationally. Her research group model had been replicated at over 20 institutions. Professors trained in her methods were operating similar programs, identifying vulnerable students and subjecting them to psychological experimentation under the guise of academic research. The network had been trading subjects, sharing techniques, and coordinating experiments across multiple institutions. Students who disappeared from one university would sometimes resurface at another as test subjects for different psychological torture protocols. Former students came forward with stories that revealed the true scope of Dr. Hendricks' influence. Many had transferred schools or dropped out entirely after being targeted by her experiment, but they'd assumed their psychological problems were due to academic stress or personal issues. Others had been hospitalized for mental health crises that were later revealed to be artificially induced through systematic psychological manipulation. Some had been recruited as unwitting accomplices, convinced they were participating in legitimate research while actually implementing psychological torture techniques on other students. They'd been carrying guilt for years over the harm they'd caused without understanding they'd been manipulated into it. The university faced a massive scandal that extended far beyond Dr. Hendricks' individual crimes. How had a tenured professor been operating a torture program for 15 years without detection? How had similar programs been allowed to flourish at universities worldwide? The answer was disturbing. Dr. Hendricks had been manipulating university administrators just as effectively as she'd manipulated students. She'd positioned herself as an expert on student mental health, offering to help administrators identify at-risk individuals who might pose problems for the institution. When students began showing signs of psychological distress, she'd volunteer to provide counseling, which actually meant subjecting them to further psychological abuse designed to either break them completely or turn them into accomplices. Her academic reputation had provided perfect cover. Published papers on psychological resilience and trauma recovery made her appear to be a legitimate researcher focused on helping people heal from mental health issues. Her consulting work with corporations and government agencies was presented as applied research in organizational psychology and conflict resolution. No one suspected that her real expertise was in destroying human minds for profit. The trial became an international sensation as the full scope of Dr. Hendricks' crimes was revealed. Victims testified about years of psychological torture disguised as therapy or research. Former accomplices described how they'd been manipulated into participating in crimes they didn't understand. But Dr. Hendricks showed no remorse. Even when confronted with video evidence of her torturing helpless victims, she maintained that her work was scientifically valuable and morally justified. Every significant advancement in human knowledge has required sacrifice, she testified. These subjects contributed to research that will benefit humanity for generations. Their suffering serves a greater purpose. When asked about the 7 students found in her basement, she described them as successful case studies and expressed pride in her ability to reconstruct human personality from scratch. I created new people, she said. I gave them better lives than the ones they had before. They should be grateful. The prosecution presented evidence that Dr. Hendricks had been operating what amounted to a human experimentation program comparable to the worst atrocities in history. She'd systematically tortured hundreds of people over 15 years while training others to do the same. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her testimony was her complete conviction that she was a misunderstood genius, whose work would eventually be recognized as revolutionary. History will vindicate me, she said during her final statement. Future generations will understand that I was conducting the most important psychological research ever attempted. The techniques I developed will reshape human civilization. Dr. Hendricks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on charges of kidnapping, torture, human trafficking, and conspiracy. But her work lived on in ways that continue to terrify me. The techniques she'd developed were already being used by intelligence agencies worldwide. Students she'd trained were working for private security firms, criminal organizations, and authoritarian governments, applying her methods to corporate espionage, political manipulation, and systematic oppression. Her manual had been copied and distributed through underground networks before law enforcement could contain it. Copies were found in the possession of cult leaders, domestic abusers, human traffickers, and terrorists who were using her psychological warfare techniques to control and destroy their victims. 6 months after her arrest, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a leather-bound book, a copy of Dr. Hendricks' complete manual, along with a letter. Your psychological profile suggests strong resistance to authority combined with naive idealism about justice. These traits make you predictably exploitable in the following ways. The letter continued for 10 pages, detailing exactly how someone could manipulate me using the techniques Dr. Hendricks had developed. It included information about my personal life that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance, suggesting that her network was still operating and still watching me. The letter was signed, "The research continues." I immediately entered a federal witness protection program and changed my identity, but the paranoia has never left me. Dr. Hendricks had taught me to see psychological manipulation everywhere, and once you learn to recognize it, you realize how common it actually is. Every advertisement uses psychological pressure techniques derived from research like hers. Every political campaign employs manipulation strategies developed by researchers studying human behavioral control. Every social media platform is designed using psychological insights that can be traced back to experiments on unwilling subjects. The line between legitimate influence and psychological manipulation is thinner than most people realize, and it's being crossed constantly by people who've learned to exploit human psychological vulnerabilities for profit or power. 3 years later, I work for a nonprofit organization that helps victims of psychological abuse, but I've had to change my identity twice more as Dr. Hendricks' associates have continued trying to track me down. I use her own research, turned inside out, to help people recognize and resist manipulation. Her techniques for breaking people down can be reversed to help them rebuild their psychological defenses and regain their sense of self. But I've learned something disturbing about human psychology. Once you understand how to manipulate people, the temptation to use that knowledge never completely goes away. I catch myself analyzing people's vulnerabilities automatically. I notice when someone is using manipulation techniques, even in innocent contexts. I can predict how people will respond to specific psychological pressures with frightening accuracy. Sometimes I have to resist the urge to use these insights to get what I want or to help people by manipulating them into making better choices. The knowledge Dr. Hendricks gave me is like a weapon I can never put down. Worse, I've started recognizing other people who've been through similar experiences. There are more Dr. Hendricks out there than anyone realizes, and they're creating a generation of people who understand psychological manipulation as a normal part of human interaction. I've met former victims who became corporate executives using psychological manipulation to control employees. Others became therapists who subtly abuse their patients. Some became parents who psychologically torture their children while convincing themselves they're providing discipline. The knowledge spreads like a virus. Everyone Dr. Hendricks touched became a carrier, spreading psychological manipulation techniques through every relationship and institution they encounter. Sometimes I wonder if this was her ultimate experiment, not just studying how to break people, but creating a world where psychological warfare is so common that everyone needs to understand it to survive. Because the most insane person I ever met wasn't clinically insane at all. She was a brilliant, methodical predator who understood exactly what she was doing and why. She'd spent decades perfecting techniques for psychological destruction while maintaining complete emotional detachment from the suffering she caused. Dr. Hendricks had discovered something terrifying about human nature. We're remarkably easy to manipulate when someone understands our psychological vulnerabilities and is willing to exploit them systematically. But she'd also discovered something else. Some people, when pushed to their absolute limits, don't break. Instead, they evolve. They develop psychological defenses that make them nearly impossible to manipulate through conventional means. The problem is that these evolved survivors often become manipulators themselves, using their hard-won knowledge to protect themselves and control others. In a twisted way, Dr. Hendricks created her own successors. Every person who survived her psychological torture became someone who understood manipulation as well as she did. We're all out there now, scattered across the world, carrying pieces of her methodology whether we want to or not. Some of us use it to help people. Others use it to hurt them. Many use it without even realizing they're doing it. But we all use it. Because once you know how easy it is to manipulate someone, how fragile human psychology really is, how much power you can have over another person's thoughts and emotions, that knowledge changes you forever, even when you're using it for good. Even when you tell yourself you're different. Even when you're absolutely certain you're nothing like the monster who taught you. The most insane person I ever met gave me the tools to recognize insanity everywhere I look, including in the mirror. And sometimes when I'm using psychological techniques to help someone heal from trauma, I hear Dr. Hendricks' voice in my head whispering, "See how easy it is? See how much power you have over them? Why limit yourself to helping when you could control?" That's when I know her real experiment is still ongoing, because she didn't just study psychological destruction, she created it. And everyone she touched became part of her research, whether we wanted to or not. The most insane thing of all? I'm not even sure she was wrong about human nature. We really are that easy to manipulate, that fragile, that predictable, and knowing that changes you forever. The research continues, whether Dr. Hendricks is in prison or not. Her techniques are being refined and improved by people who learned from her work. New generations of manipulators are being trained by institutions that haven't been exposed yet. And somewhere out there, another brilliant, methodical predator is conducting psychological experiments on unwilling subjects, telling themselves they're advancing human knowledge while destroying human lives. The cycle continues because the knowledge is too powerful to contain and too profitable to abandon. Dr. Hendricks is gone, but her legacy lives on in every person who learned that human psychology can be weaponized, that other people's minds can be controlled, that suffering can be induced with scientific precision. We're all carriers now, and the infection is spreading.